Welcome to HCA Talks Health. I'm Zena le Roux, and today Josh Jackman is joining us. So Josh is the Operations Director at A.R.T Health Solutions. So welcome, Josh. It's really good to have you on the show.
Hi,
So
Zena. Pleasure
Josh,
to be here
just
today.
yeah, please tell us a little bit more about yourself and your background, a little bit more about A.R.T Health Solutions.
Sure, yeah, we'd be happy to. So I'm operations director with A.R.T Health Solutions. So my role's very much about leading our team to deliver the products and services that we have with our range of clients. As a bit of a background to myself, I originally studied sport and exercise science, and then continued to specialize in exercise physiology. So I studied that to master's level, and then went on to do a PhD as well. Um, Shortly after sort of that academic progress, I guess I started my career and actually moved sort of more into the applied world. So I started working at GlaxoSmithKline's Human Performance Lab, where my role was mainly to drive the scientific support services that we offered to elite athletes, and then also conducting some research projects that we used to feed those insights back into their consumer healthcare division of the business. So that was a really, fun and exciting time. Got to work with a lot of different, world and Olympic athletes and Paralympic athletes. So that was really interesting from that side of things. But then also being able to conduct some, really high level research and then feed that back into, such a large organization was really eye opening. And then, I moved to kind of continue on with my PhD and finish that up. And just towards the back end of that was when I then joined A.R.T and took up a role there. And I suppose that fast forwards us to the position here today, because I'm delighted to say that I'm still with A.R.T ever since.
Wonderful. That sounds really, yeah, exciting. And I love that you've really conducted lots of research in your career. And I think, yeah, it's really it's relevant for where you're working today as well. So I know that workplace well-being is a big topic in your life and at A.R.T as well.
Mm.
So tell us a little bit more about this and what do you find are the biggest challenges for well-being in the workplace currently?
Yeah, so it's a great question. I suppose just to kind of set the scene for where A.R.T came from as well. So A.R.T Health Solutions, or A.R.T or A.R.T Health as we're kind of or A.R.T Health as we're sometimes hopefully affectionately known, was founded nearly 6 years ago now, by Dr. Paul Smith and Dr. Philip Bell, two guys who actually I met and we crossed paths with while we were working at the Human Performance Lab. So both of those guys, were both sport and exercise scientists by trade. Also had extensive careers in applied settings and across academia as well. So from there, that was where kind of the guys met and where we met as well. But they decided to set up A.R.T, I guess off the back of their time, in those various different industries, and really, I suppose after spotting a gap, where the application of that kind of similar sort of scientific methodology and the application of the data-driven approaches that we would be used to applying with elite athletes, really to help them feel and perform at their best when they go into competition. But to actually do that more within the kind of the corporate landscape, so obviously having access to sort of be, I suppose, an employee and understand that for themselves, in multinational organizations, and to actually think, there's a real opportunity there to support those sorts of individuals and organizations to really foster, those individuals to feel and perform at their best, which,
Mm,
might not be winning a gold medal, but it's still relevant to
yeah.
try and, feel and perform at your best. And that might be, looking to be as happy, healthy and high performing as you can on a day-to-day basis.
Mhm.
So that was, I suppose, where A.R.T was born from. And I suppose, like many startup organizations, we've gone on an evolution and a journey ever since. And our early work was very much around, working with some big organizations and really, I suppose, helping them to quantify perhaps some of the previously unquantifiable aspects of how the workplace design or workplace experience or different ways of working impact upon employee health, well-being, and performance. And we were able to kind of leverage our expertise and background in understanding the human and measuring the human to bring that as a slightly different method to what might have gone before, and so to really give these organizations something different and data insights that they perhaps hadn't seen before. So we've developed that over time, and lots of our work has also sort of shaped where we are today. And I suppose with that, it kind of comes back to your question in terms of workplace well-being and what that really means. And I think for us, we've sort of shaped our definition of what that means to us personally. And I think it's is creating that kind of overall sense of well-being, enabling people to be happy and healthy. But obviously that can be challenging because it's probably something individual and personal to everyone. But I suppose that's where really what we're looking to do is to provide those essential tools and the evidence to ultimately impact people's lives positively. So I suppose we've spanned from the workplace and now kind of look at kind of two dimensions of well-being, really. The first being around personal well-being, which I guess is more the emphasis on the importance of self-care in daily life, and how you look after yourself and build habits on a day-to-day basis. And then also the kind of more workplace well-being, which I suppose is more about underscoring the significance of maintaining good health and contentment in a work environment. And obviously that sort of alludes to the responsibility of organizations and leaders to put that in place for their people. So I suppose our kind of interplay now of our products and services is very much about kind of bridging that gap between the personal well-being and the workplace well-being, and trying to offer the opportunity for individuals and where individuals have responsibility, and to support them to foster the best that they can be on a day-to-day basis, but then also help organizations with their own responsibility of putting in place good practices and good workplaces and all of those other things that will help employees outside of what they can just do themselves. So that's where we are now. And I think probably leading on to kind of, I suppose, what is one of the biggest challenges, I guess it's probably quite well established that some of the elements that I've talked about there are the case in terms of what we see for what negatively impacts organizations and I suppose society in general, where whether it's from a mental well-being perspective, whether it's things like the obesity crisis, or whether that's how it translates into things like absenteeism and presenteeism in the workplace. Things like the COVID-19 pandemic have obviously accelerated people's understanding and where health and well-being sits on everyone's radars. But I think for all of the good talk, we probably find ourselves in a place now where we are at risk of, I suppose, well-being washing is one of the the terms used to describe that now, where there's lots of good messages out there, but actually is the action being taken? And I guess for all of us that are kind of passionate about this area, I think the biggest challenge that we face is really how to get those individuals, whether that be the the CEOs, the policymakers, the members of parliament, to really buy into this and help us make a kind of societal shift that will enable us to make a real difference. Other than just doing the right thing, we might need to kind of talk some of the language that really gets the buy-in from those types of individuals. So I think that's the biggest challenge at the moment, how we can really genuinely make a societal shift in that arena to make a difference.
And I think most people, not most companies, kind of know, like you're saying, what they're supposed to do. It's just about actually doing it, right? And that's a big challenge. And really figuring out where the gaps are in terms of implementing these things into our lives, right? To really make a difference. But when we talk about employee happiness, but also productivity, right? Why is this important? What is the return on investment if a company actually makes a priority of this?
I think that kind of hits the nail on the head with what I was alluding to there, with how to get that buy-in. I think for a lot of the challenges that and others that work in this space will have heard that kind of question before. What is the return on investment? And I think a lot of people would kind of potentially put up a counter argument and say, why do we need a return on investment for well-being? We should do it because it's the right thing to do. But obviously we need to convince business leaders and others to actually invest in these things, and therefore it is a fair question. And I guess sort of that leads to some of the recent research, I guess, that's the pioneering research from the Oxford University Wellbeing Research Centre, which is probably some of the first real world evidence that we can start to apply to this question, where we can start to draw some of the parallels and more of the cause and effect type arguments to why investing in well-being can really have an impact on things like productivity, which then offers us a really nice avenue to be able to then articulate that back to these organizations to actually suggest that investing in well-being that enables people to feel happier, to drive their health, actually ultimately does have an impact on the bottom line, and that then becomes a very difficult thing to start to wonder why it isn't being put in place, if those arguments are being able to be put forward with such strength.
Mm. So I know that there's a study that I've read talking about happiness and productivity. Specifically, I think they did the study on call center workers. Can you tell us more about that? So how happiness actually enhanced productivity?
Yes, it's a really great study by that Oxford University research group led by Professor Jan Emanuel Deneve. And what they did there was they took data on almost 1,800 British Telecom call center workers across a roughly 6-month period, and during that time they what sounds quite simply sent out an email to all of those employees during that time and just asked them to respond with their personally rate their levels of happiness across the previous week. What they did with those scores was in that they were able to anonymously map them back to the individual's personal workplace performance for that period. So understanding things like their personal sales performance in the call center environments. And what they were able to find was that when these individuals had a 1-point increase in their happiness, so that's on a scale of 0 to 10. So, for example, going from a 5 out of 10 to a 6 out of 10, that 1-point increase, that was associated with a 12% increase in their productivity as measured by their weekly sales data. And what was perhaps even more surprising, but really kind of drummed the point home, was actually that the effect of happiness differed across the task. So, if we take that same 1-point increase, but actually look at some of the more complex tasks, I guess, like things like negotiating or selling sales bundles, or recontracting with potential customers, they actually saw productivity increases closer to 20%
Wow.
on average per that 1-point increase in happiness. So that was some of the first real world evidence, I guess, of demonstrating the impact outside of potentially the laboratory environments, where driving happiness had a direct impact on those individuals' performance, and in this case in the kind of call center and sales environment. So I think that becomes a really strong business case to others in that area, or certainly starts to pose questions to other types of work in terms of productivity or performance, and obviously how we can drive happiness to impact positively on the business bottom line in those areas.
Yeah. So we know that improving employee happiness will drive enhanced productivity, right? So that's a fantastic return on investment. But so if we know that, yes, happiness drives productivity, then the next natural question is, but how can we promote happiness, right? So what are your thoughts around that? How can we promote happiness?
Yeah, and I guess that becomes the next existential question, right? And that's not an easy one to answer, but I think what we're essentially looking at here is if happiness then becomes, I suppose, the output, we're trying to figure out what are some of the inputs that are going to be able to feed into that machine, I guess, for want of a better term, to enable us to feel happier. And I suppose that's where we've done some kind of digging around our own data set from our perspective at ART. We've got a whole host of data from over the last 6 or so years where we're able to look at a bit of this. And I suppose what we've done is developed out our own kind of framework that sits around some of the fundamentals of well-being. So things like people's movement, recovery, nutrition, and mindset as the 4 kind of key pillars, I guess, that are
Mm,
paramount to overall well-being.
mm,
Um, and what we've found is that, when we've looked more in depth at some of these different aspects, we've found that there's, some really strong correlations between the, positively impacting people's well-being and that sits under these different pillars that can be really key drivers of happiness. And without being able to go the full extent as the guys have done in the study and show the difference to productivity, it starts to paint that picture in a little bit more depth as to how we can implement some habits, behaviors, or actions that can help to drive happiness.
mm.
And then hopefully we start to be able to continue that work on it and draw the line all the way through to the productivity. But even in the absence of that, we start to understand and link it to some of this previous research that might well indicate that we can definitely make a leap, that if we're able to input some of these things, then it's likely to drive people's performance in a workplace setting.
Oh. Okay, so let's look at those four elements. Maybe we can just touch briefly on all of them. So let's start with movement. So how have you found, how can movement make us happier?
Yeah, and I guess with this one, what we're talking about when we're discussing movement is, we're probably all aware of, the endorphin releasing effects of
Mm,
exercise on our mood. But actually what we're talking about here doesn't actually necessarily require us, to go to those lengths, to have such high intensity. It's actually, just more about moving the body in ways that could be quite common, in a workplace environment. Um, so what we've found, from again looking at some of our own data, is actually when we separate out a group of participants, we've got over 100 participants in one of these specific data sets, and we looked at individuals that had gotten over 8,000 steps across a 12-week period, and compared them to a group who'd gotten less than 5,000 over that, on average over that same 12-week period. There
mm,
was actually a 1 point difference in their happiness on a very similar scale to
mm,
what were previously referenced from the Oxford Research Group. So what we're seeing there is the link between happiness and movement is that being able to move more, getting at least 8,000 steps, which in some of the recent research has also been linked to reduced all-cause mortality and obviously other health benefits. But actually, here we're seeing that it has a tangible impact on that kind of happiness scale. And one of the other things we saw alongside that was that it also, the more active group also saw an improvement in their cognitive performance, by 12%. So cognitive performance is something that at A.R.T we measure by our own smartphone application. So that's using some of the sort of scientifically validated tasks that you would typically see in laboratory environments to assess different elements of cognitive function. But we've built that into a smartphone application that we can use to assess that in different workforces, I suppose anywhere in the world really, and link that back to some of the the well-being and the movement data that we can track from wearable devices, and then obviously be able to piece all of that together. So that's what we're seeing there. We're seeing being more active is linked to increasing happiness, but that's also linked to the improvements in cognitive performance.
mm.
So yeah, very similar findings, I guess, to some of that what the Oxford Research Group saw, and really backs up some of the science that we're seeing behind movement as a really key pillar to help drive the happiness and productivity that we're seeing in different workforces.
And I think it's quite, I mean, I think most people are aware of how the endorphins are released, right? When we move, we just feel better. But also the increased blood flow to the brain, and I guess that links up to that optimal cognitive performance that you were talking about. But also reduction in stress hormones, right? Such as cortisol. So just feeling less stress, just maybe feeling more able to cope with the stress that you are experiencing. So that, yeah, it makes a lot of sense. All right, and then the next one is recovery. So, what does recovery mean, first of all, and how could it improve our happiness as well?
Yes, I think the key thing with this one, again, sort of similar to movement, is to to define what we mean by that. And again, hopefully it helps to make it a more friendly term, because recovery doesn't have to mean trying to sleep as much as we can,
Yeah.
and trying to kind of attain unachievable sort of durations of sleep. Actually, recovery is much more than that, because it can be about those small periods of rest and recovery that we can take even throughout the day. Things like micro breaks, have been shown to be a really powerful tool in some of our data to help people to, you know, just reduce their levels of stress throughout the day, or just be able to take a piece of a break to kind of have that mindful moment that helps them to just reset slightly. So when we talk about recovery here, it's about, you know, it is about sleep, but it's also about all of those different things that you can do throughout the day to, you know, those kind of non-sleep deep relaxation moments to help us to kind of achieve some of those levels of relaxation that we would see. And I guess similarly, you know, to the movement, we've found some really positive impacts of implementing those sorts of recovery mechanisms on the happiness and on the performance elements. So I think one of the things we've found consistently, you know, which is probably unsurprising to most people, but it's, you know, it's consistently seen that actually getting more sleep helps individuals to perform at their highest levels, and actually we see their highest levels of happiness. So we got the highest level of happiness on days when people got more sleep the night before. So 3% more sleep then relates to people feeling at their best on those next days. And you know, some of the things that we've also seen alongside that is, you know, as I mentioned, the kind of the taking breaks. So there was a really great piece of research from Microsoft that assessed individuals' brainwave activity throughout a working day, and what they found was that back-to-back meetings, you know, really accumulated you know, the elements of stress in people's brains that you know, would build up as the day went on. But what the guys in that research project found was actually the simple remedy of having a short break in between those meetings enabled individuals to have those short bouts of recovery that enabled them to feel certainly less exhausted by the end of the day, but also enabled them to improve their ability to focus and engage while in, you know, in those meetings. So a simple you know, practical tip of being able to implement a 5-minute break at the end of a, you know, of a Teams call when you know you've got one coming up, you know, on the hour, the next hour, can, you know, just give you that few minutes to just take yourself away and you know, almost remedy the accumulation of the stress that might build up without those sorts of breaks. So we've similarly found in some of our data that individuals who are able to take regular breaks are 23% less stressed than those who don't take any time for themselves. So again, you know, very much marrying up these different pieces of research, but providing a really solid foundation to suggest that these are things that, you know, hopefully aren't too taxing to input and put in place. You know, they are these small habits and behaviors, but added together, they can make a real difference to, you know, to happiness and to productivity.
I think when we think about recovery, we might think about, you know, taking a break, going on holiday, you know, sleeping properly. And of course, I mean, I'm definitely more happy when I slept well. But even 5-minute breaks, like you're saying, could make such a big difference. So do you have like a recommended amount of 5-minute breaks throughout the day, or could anything be beneficial? Any amount of breaks?
Yeah, I think it's always going to be individual, dependent on, you know, how you feel yourself, how your previous, you know, even your previous day's been, and you know, almost you know, you kind of, when you get to know your own body. But I think the main thing is to kind of bring awareness to when you feel like those breaks are needed. So typically, I think it's kind of well established that, you know, how as humans we can only sort of concentrate, you know, do deep concentration and focus work for a certain period of time before, you know, we do naturally start to you know, need those sorts of breaks. So I think even, you know, up to periods of 90 minutes, you know, certainly that at that point you'd be thinking actually of needing a break, as you know, as a minimum. But I think depending on, you know, if you've had a busy period, then it might be something to bring awareness to, that you might be more likely to need a, you know, just a short break. If you've been conducting a, you know, a really intense piece of work, whether that requires focus and concentration or whether it requires, you know, interaction with others, again, that might be something that might increase the frequency, I guess, of the need to take those breaks. But I think that the first stop is really to sort of bring awareness to your own body and how you're feeling in yourself, and then start to kind of recognize those times when, you know, that additional frequency might be needed, or, you know, when just even in the moment that just taking a couple of minutes might be all it takes to kind of just reset and get back to a place where then you can kind of move forward from in a better position.
Yeah. So having that self-awareness and responding to what the body needs, right? And I think that is also relevant when it comes to fueling ourselves properly. So, I mean, it's not surprising that another element that you focus on is nutrition. right, the way we feel ourselves is obviously to a large degree how we are going to feel, our energy levels, etc. So how should we be eating to make us happier and therefore more productive as well?
Yeah, I mean, there's been really great evidence and a clear link between food and our mood,
Mm,
and we know that nutrition is fundamental to health and performance. We're all aware that the essential nutrients that our bodies need to function optimally are
mm,
provided by how we fuel ourselves, and that spans everything from our physical health to our cognitive function, and then obviously our how that extends to our overall vitality. So I guess there's probably not so much direct research that's really shown the link between what we eat and happiness, more so in a work related environment. But I think what we can take from some general studies is that we can take some, I suppose, some really clear and practical take home messages that resonate sort of throughout this area, which I think is kind of one of which is around making sure there's variety in your diet. So focusing on kind of a healthy and diverse balance. So we've got fortunate to have Mary, an in-house nutritionist in our team, and Mary's always really keen on suggesting that there's no need to necessarily restrict any food groups, unless there's a specific and likely medical reason to do so. So actually,
mm,
talks about kind of trying to paint the rainbow on your plate, and trying to get as many diverse colors and food groups in. So that's one really great area, and a way to be able to foster general feelings of well-being, and that have been seen in the research that can boost mood and happiness. um I think another one of the sort of the emerging areas is in particular around gut health. Our guts been kind of called our second brain, which is sort of to do a lot with the release of serotonin in our gut, which affects our mood, and also linked to our immune system, and just generally how we handle stress. And I think most people can resonate with the gut feeling, which is something that we might feel when we're stressed or anxious, and that is probably a lot to do with that. So I think probiotics are obviously something which has been looked at in terms of being a potentially beneficial bacteria that can support that healthy balance in our guts and our digestive system, that can again indirectly influence better sleep patterns and better mood. We've actually conducted a piece of research ourselves where we found that individuals had an increased sleep duration during the night when taking a probiotic supplementation. So
mm.
again, some evidence there that by keeping our gut happy, we're able to kind of eat in a healthy and diverse way with the probiotic containing foods. That's going to help support things like recovery. All of these different areas are interlinked. Hydration is obviously always an area that's going to be key. So hydrating little and often. We know that dehydration can negatively impact people's mood, and just general feelings of kind of anxiety and fatigue. And then I think one of the things that kind of links back to what we just mentioned around the kind of the awareness piece, and it's something that I know from discussions with Mary and myself, I've even implemented a lot more, is just being able to pay attention to what you're eating, and the different food groups, and also how you're eating. So being able to potentially be aware of trying to eat mindfully. So that might be just being aware of the moment when you're eating, and not necessarily being kind of consumed by watching the TV, or
Yeah.
being on your phone, and all of those different things that almost suddenly the meal's gone by in a flash and you didn't even remember taking a mouthful just because you've been scrolling, and all of these other things. So actually being able to just take a moment and use that as a really great time to bring awareness to how those different food groups and make you feel, but also how they're fueling you and helping your body to become better placed for overall well-being.
Yeah, very important. So it's really not just about what we're eating, but how we're eating it, what environment we are in when we're doing that, not distracting ourselves when eating, right? That's also important. But I like the idea of not necessarily restricting anything, because I think that could actually take away some joy, right? When we're on to a restrictive diet, or, thinking about what I'm not allowed to have all the time. So I like the idea of just adding variety, making sure that you're getting all the different nutrients by eating the rainbow, right? All right. So the last element is mindset. And I can imagine that the way we see the world can significantly influence our happiness. But maybe you can tell us a little bit more about why this is.
For sure. Yeah, so I think again the impact of mindset generally on happiness has obviously become a really key topic generally and gained increasing attention. And I think some of the great work around things like a positive mindset, things like a growth mindset, can really foster sort of that resilience and optimism, and obviously can significantly influence our happiness and overall well-being. So
Mm.
I think some of the really good practices that can be built into our daily routines that can be, I suppose, valuable tools for almost in the moment, and immediately being able to change how our brains are functioning, and potentially to kind of enhance our mood and reduce stress and those sorts of things. Include things like self-talk, things like gratitude, and the ability to again bring awareness to sometimes when maybe we need to implement some of those tools, maybe when our minds are racing and starting to play kind of irrational thoughts in our head. They're the times to kind of just become aware of those different times, and actually sort of bring ourselves back to that central moment, whether that's again through the process of something like grounding. So again, what we've seen through some of our own data is that when individuals are at their happiest, what we found is that generally they're better able to manage their stress. They're able to manage it in some cases such that it's 9% lower. And some of the tools that can be used are, again, we talked about micro breaks, but actually in this instance, implementing mindful breaks. So having that short pause. It could be taking part in a mindfulness activity. It could be a guided breathing exercise. And we found that the individuals that implement these types of activities or tools can see 7% reduction in their stress after taking a mindful break. And they generally report 75% have reported that after taking a mindful break that it positively impacted their level of productivity. So again, making that link between people's moods, their happiness, potentially their stress, but also then linking it back to productivity as well. And then, as I mentioned, things like self-talk and grounding can also be tools that could be utilized either in things like mindful and micro breaks, or just generally as good practice, either at certain periods throughout the day, to really change our mindsets and enable us to, I suppose, get some of these tools in as a kind of a natural thought process. And once they become a habit, they kind of become part of our everyday, and they don't seem such a task. They just become part of that kind of normal process. And so it does take a lot of practice, and it's something that it does take time. But I think if individuals are willing to kind of learn from their own reflective practice around that, and really kind of try to build some of these things in, then they will for sure see lots of the benefits that can be gained from that.
But it seems like gaining happiness, it's not that simple, right? There's many different elements that we need to look at. And as we've been discussing, it's sure, these well-being fundamentals, right, of movement, recovery, nutrition, and mindset, it can actually enhance the individual productivity, right? But can we be sure that driving happiness will actually lead to organizational success above the individual productivity as well?
Mm. And I think going back to sort of some of what we chatted about at the start, that's becomes the key question, because I think for for business leaders, the individual productivity is gonna certainly raise the interest levels, and they're gonna be interested to see actually, okay, we can increase people's happiness, we can improve all of these different elements of their well-being fundamentals. But actually, how does that relate to the business?
Yeah.
And I think some of the, again, going back to some of the really sort of pioneering research from the Oxford University Research Group has shown that what they're seeing in the kind of the field is that actually the most successful organizations aren't prioritizing their profit over their people. They're actually profiting by prioritizing their people. And some of the data that they've seen, they've collaborated with the platform Indeed, and they've shown that there's a positive correlation between self-reported well-being data from individuals that use that platform, and well-being scores for workforces or these firms in terms of their profitability, their return on assets, and even their stock market performance. So one of the areas that they looked at in more detail was that companies with high wellbeing ratings on Indeed actually typically outperformed the market. So if you'd invested £1,000 in one of the top ranked companies for wellbeing in January 2021, you would have had 20% more by March 2023 than if you'd have followed the S&P 500. So,
Oh, wow.
some really tangible impact that at an organizational level, by fostering perhaps a culture or a way of working that facilitates well-being, or at least that employees feel that facilitates well-being, is more likely to drive that organizational performance all the way up to things like their profitability. One of the other things that was found outside of those KPIs was also that the lower an organization scored in those well-being scores on Indeed, the greater number of job searches from employees of that organization. So the more likely those individuals were going to be potentially looking what else was out there, because individuals these days are really prioritizing how an environment and how an organization is able to foster their own, I suppose, sense of purpose, but also sense of well-being. And now we're seeing more often that individuals are placing that as a priority, even at or potentially even above sometimes things like salary. So that investment in well-being is certainly going to pay itself back when we start to think about the impact to individual productivity, but then obviously talent attraction and retention being a key component as well, and then obviously the organizational value that comes from from that profitability and linked to that productivity. So starts to really build out that business case and go and stretch far beyond just how individuals are implementing those well-being fundamentals to drive their own happiness and productivity, but actually the additional compounding value across an organization actually starts to really make a big difference to the bottom line.
I'm so glad that that shift is starting to take place, right? And that the research is actually there to back it up now. That, companies do much better when the people are happy and well, compared to where, we often see where the companies just try to push the employees as far as possible and to get as much out of them as possible. And that's it's not a formula for success, right? So really thinking about it in this way, I think will really encourage lots of businesses to maybe do it in a different way. So this is what A.R.T is all about, right? You actually help companies to do this, because thinking about where to start, how do you actually help people to implement this? I guess this is what you do, right? So how can A.R.T help?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that the first question to consider is what is it that you would like to address as I suppose an organization, and as I touched on there, thinking about it in terms of those sort of two dimensions of well-being. Is it that is your goal to support people's well-being, and enable them to to drive their own personal well-being, or is it actually more around driving that great culture, the workplace experience or the well-being strategy? And I suppose that puts that emphasis and the responsibility in a slightly different position. If it's more the personal well-being element, then what we find is that often organizations won't have necessarily the in-house expertise, or potentially the time or even the budget to do something in-house. And that's where we've created our own digital solution, One Wellbeing, which is all about enabling us to put all of our background and expertise in the academic world and working with elite athletes, as I mentioned, and to really drive that into a solution that enables your organizations and your people to get the best of physiologists, psychologists, nutritionists, but with to support these individuals with their own well-being fundamentals, in particular around the movement, recovery, nutrition, and mindset. I suppose at the touch of a button, really. And we've recently launched that, and we're taking on some clients that want to get involved at this early stage. So get to be the perks of being one of the early adopters on that. And I suppose really to summarize it in a quote with how we see this, it's about not overlooking the basics, not ignoring the foundational concepts, because I suppose how long can a tree remain standing without its roots, is a nice way to summarize it. And that's sort of the way we look at look at One Wellbeing, really it's about providing those foundation elements for employees and potentially for organizations that might have those challenges around kind of expertise, time or budget. And then more towards the organizational side of things, so like I said, whether it's that culture, the workplace experience, the wellbeing strategy, then we've got a more of a consultancy service, which is more all about providing actionable insights and an evidence-based approach to kind of really unpick that for you and to drive the the health, wellbeing and performance of your people. So as I mentioned, we've worked with some really large multinational companies over the last 5-6 years, and variety of case studies in this area have enabled us to kind of bring this to life. So whether that's bespoke challenges to your organization, to your people, to your workplaces, we can I suppose foster a scientific approach and methodology to really understand, collect that data, whether that be smaller sprints or larger projects, and deliver that as an end-to-end service where our team can input our expertise to ultimately drive those insights back into the business, and as I said, perhaps quantify some of those previously unquantifiable elements that give you the kind of real eye-opening, evidence-based and actionable insights that enable you to take impact. And some of our projects, we've seen consistently that 75% of the employees that take part in those projects themselves actually report that it's had a really positive impact on their well-being. So it's not just providing benefits for the organization in terms of how they're able to implement that back into the business, but obviously the employees by taking part, and a lot of it, as I mentioned, is down to the awareness that it brings, often report that it's really helped them on their health and well-being journey wherever they may be at that point.
Wonderful. Yeah, it sounds fantastic. So where can people find out more? I know that you've got a website, or you're also on social media.
Yep. Yeah. So for me personally, I'm probably most active on LinkedIn. So people can just search Josh Jackman and find me on there. For ART, yeah, again, we've got the website, arthealthsolutions.com. And we're also on Instagram, LinkedIn and Twitter. If you search for ART Health Solutions, I'm sure you'll find us. And then we've also recently launched dedicated channels for One Wellbeing as well. So again, I think if you head to the ART pages, then I'm sure you'll find some more content, sort of more specifically to the personal wellbeing side of things from there. But yeah, more than happy to point people in the right direction if they can get in contact with me, and I can try and help where I can.
Right. Thank you so much. Yeah, and thank you. I think the content's really interesting, and I'm sure that you've got a real sense of purpose in your own job, right? Through enabling people to live happier, more productive, and more successful lives, right? So thank you so much for joining us, and yeah, all the best with any future endeavors.
Thanks very much, Zena. It's been a pleasure to talk today.